Morning. Call the meeting to order. Welcome. Before we get started, just one quick announcement. I made the announcement yesterday and sent it around. We are going to, on the questioning, go in reverse order this morning. Least senior and on up. So, welcome to this hearing. We are having our posture hearing this morning, focusing on CENTCOM and AFRICOM. And we are very honored this morning to have with us General Thomas Waldhauser, who is the commander of U.S. Africa Command, and General Joseph Votel, who is the commander of U.S. Central Command, as well as Ms. Catherine Wheelbarger, who is the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. I want to begin by thanking General Votel and General Waldhauser. I know you're very sad that this is your last opportunity to testify before Congress and have this hearing, but I want to make special note of it and thank you both for years of outstanding service to our country. It's been a pleasure working with both of you. Yes, well. And this morning we are going to hear specifically from you about what is going on in your areas of responsibility, and they are areas where there is a lot going on in terms of our national security concerns. Beginning in Africa, we have a presence throughout that continent, and there are a number of issues we're concerned about. I think it begins with the threat from transnational terrorist groups, both in the Horn of Africa and in West Africa as well. We look forward to hearing an update on how our efforts are going there, both to keep those transnational terrorist threats at bay. Also, how are we working with our various partners, both in the region and allies in NATO, to help contain that threat. And then the overall issue in that region continues to be stability, particularly in Somalia and Libya, and how are we doing on building sustainable governments in those places so that we can reduce the threat. We are also curious, as we have made the transition from better than a decade of primarily focusing on the transnational terrorist threats to a new era of great power conflict in Russia and China. And Russia and China, I know, are involved throughout Africa, also in various places within the CENTCOM responsibility, so hearing about what they are up to as well will be of concern. In CENTCOM, we continue to have a specific focus on Iraq and Syria, as the caliphate is just about wiped out, but ISIS is still a presence in that region, as are other transnational terrorist threats, and certainly the same is true in Afghanistan. So getting an update on that is our primary concern. Now, as a general rule, we want to try to get to the point where we do not have to have a military presence in as many places in the world as we have. That's my personal objective. We'd like to rely on partners, reduce the necessity of us having troops abroad, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we are meeting our national security objectives and protecting ourselves from that. And the one comment I will make, and I know this is not either of your gentlemen's doing, but we need a consistent policy that our allies can rely on. I think it is problematic when we make dramatic, altering decisions in what seems like the blink of an eye in a presidential tweet. It's not that I don't think we need to get to the point where we reduce our troop presence in Syria and Afghanistan. It's just not something we should do in that ad hoc a manner. It catches our allies off guard and creates problems. I was reading extensively where it has significantly damaged our relationship with President Macron in France. He was caught completely by surprise by our decision that we were going to pull out of Syria. Now, the truth is we're building towards a drawdown in Syria. The point was, we wanted to build up to defeat ISIS, remove the caliphate, and get to the point where we could pass responsibility off to partners in the region. And if we had discussions with our allies and announced those plans in a rational way, I think that would help maintain the strength of our alliances. So we are concerned by the way the policy seems to bounce around from day to day. Same is true in Afghanistan, as the announcement was made a couple months back that we were going to, I believe the tweet was, completely pull out of Afghanistan. I know that hasn't happened, and I know there's been updates since then, but a more consistent policy, I think, would help us maintain our allies and help build the confidence in the United States that is necessary to maintain those allies and maintain our interests. I look forward to testimony from both of you, and also Ms. Wheelbarger, appreciate you being here as well. You're not retiring, I'm sorry, it's sort of their day in that regard, but we appreciate your work as well. We thank you all for being here. With that, I will turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to welcome our witnesses and express my appreciation and respect for General Votel and General Walthizer. My understanding is General Votel's change of command will be at the end of this month, General Walthizer sometime this summer. I think it's worth just stopping for a second and reflecting on the significant progress that has been made against certain terrorist networks in recent years. To me, 2014 doesn't seem that long ago, but ISIS controlled an area the size of Great Britain. And today we're talking about the last village and a tremendous change of affairs on the ground. Somalia has been a challenge for us when it comes to terrorism for a long time, and my sense is that we have made tremendous progress there as well. Now, this progress is a result of a lot of folks, including some decisions by this administration to untie the hands of our military to be more effective. But the two gentlemen before us have been at the center of those efforts. In various capacities, SOCOM, CENTCOM, AFRICOM, commands on the ground, and each of them has played a leading role in making this progress, and I think it's important to step back and reflect. Like you, Mr. Chairman, I share the concerns about where we go going forward. We made a lot of progress on terrorists, but they're not gone. As a matter of fact, in some ways, they've spread out and are more difficult to locate. And so we must maintain pressure on terrorist networks, and yet because of the rise in great power competition, our resources have to be spread in a variety of different ways. And while we maintain pressure on terrorist networks in CENTCOM and AFRICOM, there is great power competition going on in both of those regions as well. Which we cannot lose sight of. Many of us have seen that firsthand as we travel to Africa as well as to the Middle East. So there's a lot to talk about. I want to, again, just return to appreciation for not only their service, but the successful results of their leadership in these challenges that we've faced, and I look forward to the conversations to come.
Thank you, and we'll begin with Ms. Wheelbarger.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on policy matters related to the United States Central Command.
I apologize, but could you pull the microphone
Sure.
a little bit closer to your face there?
Sure, I'll try to speak up.
Terrific, thank you.
Alongside Commanders General Votel and General Walthizer. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the men and women of the Department of Defense, their families, whose dedication, their dedication, their talents, and sacrifice enable us to execute our policies around the world every day. You said this may be General Votel's last hearing. This is my first, so I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the committee for your strong collaboration and bipartisan support that you provide the Department of Defense. That's a vital contribution this committee makes to our dialogue on defense issues nationwide. My time as a senior staff member with national security committees in both the House and the Senate instilled in me a great respect for the leadership that this committee provides and the invaluable contribution connection you provide to the American people. Students of military history spend a great deal of attention on the relationship between military commanders and statesmen, or rather the proper level of civilian oversight of military activity and operations. An equally important component of military history is understanding national will, and that is the will to see threats clearly, approach them with sound policy, and remain committed to the country's defense, even when the cost seems high. In the American system, the U.S. Congress is a fulcrum point where thoughtful oversight and sustained national will can come together. It is a noble and sometimes difficult challenge, and we at the Department appreciate your unique role in ensuring our military has the resources, authorities, and the legitimacy necessary to deter and defeat any foe. It is a great privilege and honor for me to be here today with two very devoted commanders to explain our defense policy to these regions. Our policy approach is nested in the guidance from the 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy. In support of the NSS goals to protect the American people, defend the homeland, and promote prosperity and peace from a position of strength, the NDS focuses on three aspects of U.S. power: our lethality, our partners and allies, and our institutions. It sets long-term competition with other states as our top national security priority, even while we continue to address regional and terrorism threats. To compete in today's complex security environment, to defend future generations of Americans against near-peer competitors, and to manage ongoing threats from North Korea, Iran, and terrorist groups, we must make certain adjustments to our posture. We must also avoid prioritizing urgent problems at the expense of building readiness and capacity for potential high-end conflict into the future. We must deter and confront adversaries while avoiding miscalculation or escalation that would distract and ultimately undermine our national security interests. In the Middle East and Africa, our policy objective is to increase regional stability and secure and advance U.S. interests, working by, with, and through a network of international partners. By enhancing the capabilities and capacity of our partners, we reduce the risk to our homeland while increasing the internal security and stability of vulnerable states, often playing a supporting role to other government agencies and partners in the region. Specifically with the Middle East, it remains vitally important to our national security interests for 4 fundamental reasons. First, we are involved in active operations at the request of and support to our partners in countering extremists that threaten the region and the homeland. Second, the Middle East is the crossroads of global competition with Russia and China. Third, we face an aggressive Iran whose actions destabilize the region. And finally, our national security and economy depend on open commerce through the Middle East maritime domain and the free flow of natural resources. We must remain postured and engaged throughout this region. To that end, DoD's policy objectives are to ensure continued success in our campaign against ISIS and al-Qaeda and in support of our partners in the region, while also preparing to compete with China, Russia, and Iran for regional and global influence. We also invest in sustainable partnerships to reduce vulnerabilities of weak states as part of a whole-of-government effort to address instability. With our partners, we have ongoing CT campaigns in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. We also are investing in defense partnerships that continue to allow us to gain far more than we invest in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, and throughout the Gulf. Our partners are key to securing our interests in the region. We understand the importance and trust in place upon the Department of Defense for the security of every American, and our commitment to our national security and prosperity in this theater remains strong, even as we address a host of other current and future threats. In Africa, vast, diverse, and dynamic, Africa is a continent of opportunities as well as challenges, with the possibility of surging in either direction. The department must remain engaged in the region to foster positive trends and arrest the negative ones. As outlined in the 2018 Dod Strategy for Africa, the department will continue to pursue African-led security solutions while maintaining the ability to act unilaterally to protect U.S. citizens and interests. As such, DoD supports U.S. whole-of-government efforts to address African security challenges, leverages international partnerships to support U.S. security objectives, maintains strategic access and influence, and seeks low-cost, resource-sustainable, and innovative security solutions. Employing our by, with, and through approach, we use a variety of tools, including capacity-building programs, security assistance, military equipment sales, education, training, and exercises to work closely with African and other international partners to achieve our policy goals. Those goals are to, first, seek to advance U.S. interests and influence in the region and maintain strategic access, which is especially important in an era of increasing near-peer competition. Second, we seek to deny safe haven to terrorists and disrupt their ability to direct or support external operations against the U.S. Third, we seek to support our Department of State and other interagency colleagues by securing U.S. diplomatic posts. Fourth, we strive to grow current partners and develop new relationships. And finally, we seek to enhance African partner capability to achieve our shared objectives into the future. In conclusion, the department is well positioned to address the range of dynamic issues facing the United States in the Middle East and Africa. Our balanced approach helps ensure the department can meet a variety of present and future threats while enhancing the strength and agility of our forces. I thank you for the opportunity to share our views today.
Thank you very much. General Votel?
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, good morning and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm honored to testify alongside Acting Assistant Secretary Katie Wilbarger and my friend and fellow Minnesotan, General Tom Waldhauser. I come before you today on behalf of the men and women working tirelessly across the Central Command area of responsibility. They are the best, and I'm proud to stand among them as their commander. All of these great Americans have families and communities across our country that support their service members from near and far, and we are equally proud and appreciative of their service and sacrifice as well. CENTCOM remains a dynamic, challenging, dangerous, yet hopeful area of responsibility, an area of great contrast and contradiction, rich with history, culture, youth, and resources, but riven with sectarianism, violence, disenfranchisement, and economic disparity. It is an area where we retain vital national interests, preventing attacks on our homeland, countering malign and destabilizing influence, preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and ensuring freedom of navigation and commerce through critical international waterways. I'd like to use my time this morning to give you a quick overview of our key ongoing operations and opportunities. In Afghanistan, the President's South Asia strategy is working. The efforts of our Special Representative for Afghan Reconciliation, Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, show there is a path to progress, but there is much left to do to achieve our end state of reconciliation between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. Toward this end, our military efforts are focused on supporting the Afghan security forces and providing Ambassador Khalilzad the maximum military pressure and leverage to support his diplomatic efforts to establish a framework that will lead to an Afghan dialogue, a reduction in violence, and ultimately a negotiated settlement. Importantly, we cannot forget that Afghanistan was used as a platform to attack our citizens and homeland in 2001, and we have to ensure this never happens again. Safeguarding this national interest and preventing violent extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Khorasan from plotting attacks against our country is also a continuing effort for our forces, one that we will need to be prepared to address as long as violent extremists can operate from this region. In Iraq and Syria, the unrelenting efforts of the 79-member Defeat ISIS coalition, the determination and bravery of the Iraqi security forces and our Syrian Democratic Force partners has largely liberated the so-called physical caliphate of ISIS, an area of 34,000 square miles which they once controlled, now reduced to less than a single square mile. Reduction of the physical caliphate is a monumental military accomplishment, but the fight against ISIS and violent extremism is far from over. While ISIS has been battered by the Syrian Democratic Forces and coalition forces, we should be clear that what we are seeing now is not the surrender of ISIS as an organization, but a calculated decision to preserve the safety of their families and preservation of their capabilities by taking their chances in camps for internally displaced persons and going to ground in remote areas and waiting for the right time to resurge. Recent observations by our men and women on the ground highlight that the ISIS population being evacuated from the remaining vestiges of the caliphate largely remain unrepentant, unbroken, and radicalized. We will need to maintain a vigilant offensive against this now widely dispersed and disaggregated organization that includes leaders, fighters, facilitators, resources, and of course their toxic ideology. And the broader international community will need to determine how we deal with the thousands of fighters and family members now being held and safeguarded by the Syrian Democratic Forces. In my view, this is a serious generational problem that, if not handled properly, will sow the seeds of future violent extremism. As the Defeat ISIS campaign in Syria transitions from liberating terrain to enabling local security forces and addressing the ISIS clandestine insurgency, we will continue our deliberate withdrawal of forces and capabilities as directed by the President, but also retain a residual force on the ground to continue our mission and safeguard our interests. These details are being developed now and will emphasize campaign continuity and capitalize on the contributions of our coalition partners. In Yemen, the fragile ceasefire in the port of Hodeidah is a promising, albeit increasingly challenging to implement step, demonstrating some willingness on both sides of the conflict to negotiate and end this humanitarian disaster. Towards this objective, CENTCOM supports the diplomatic efforts and work of the United Nations Special Envoy to facilitate the peace process by providing advice and assistance and serving as an interlocutor through our trusted relationships in the region. We also remain steadfast in reminding the Saudi-led coalition partners of their obligations under the law of armed conflict and ensuring that the fight in Yemen does not spread across the region, sowing more instability and threatening critical infrastructure and U.S. lives and interests. In Yemen, we also face a threat from violent extremist groups. To address this, we work closely with our indigenous partners to disrupt these organizations to ensure they do not have the capability or opportunity to attack our country or citizens or those of our partners. I assess that our current efforts are keeping these organizations in a state that limits their ability to conduct external operations. We must continue to do this. Against the backdrop of these conflicts is the Iranian regime. Their efforts are not limited to the support they provide to the Houthis in Yemen. They strive to be a regional hegemon and use malign influence, qualitatively and quantitatively expanded capabilities, and facilitation and support to multiple proxies to exert pressure, threaten other countries in the region, supplant U.S. and Western influence, and threaten access to critical waterways vital to global commerce. Our military efforts here are focused on supporting the broader U.S. government pressure campaign through deterrence, assurance, and competition. Our longstanding military relationships with partners across the region are critical to this effort. The Iranian regime remains the long-term destabilizing factor in this region. We do see reasons for optimism across the region. The capabilities and resilience of the Afghan Special Operations Forces are notable and mark them as a reliable counterterrorism partner for the future. The emerging relationships in the Central Asian states look to provide us opportunities in an area long dominated and influenced by Russia and China. An Iraqi security force that has risen from the ashes of 2014 and now proudly and capably protects their country against ISIS resurgence can be a bulwark to future extremism. Egyptian armed forces have more effectively fought ISIS in the Sinai and are now taking active measures to address the underlying issues that give life to these violent extremist groups and are helping to contain the threat. Steadfast partners like Jordan are making the most of the support we provide to maintain their singularly unique role of moderation in the region. A highly innovative and increasingly professional Lebanese armed force is emerging as a legitimate protector of their nation and a good partner to us. And partners across the Gulf join us in countering terrorism, providing security in the maritime environment, and effectively defending against missile threat. And so it goes in the central region today and every day. Great promise and opportunity mixed with contradiction and conflict. Let me conclude my remarks where I started, with our people and their families. They are the best America has to offer, and they continually demonstrate commitment and devotion to our nation, our mission, and to each other. They deserve the best equipment, the best pay, the best health care, and the best housing. Their commitment is surpassed only by the families that support them, and they deserve our best as well. As I conclude my tour in the next few weeks as the commander of U.S. Central Command, I want to thank all of you, members of this committee and your staff, and indeed all of the members of Congress and the staff, for your strong support to our men and women in uniform, our Department of Defense civilians and their families. I ask for your continued support to provide our servicemen and women everything they need to accomplish their missions and lead healthy, fulfilling lives and continuing service to our nation. Thank you again for allowing me to represent CENTCOM before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General Waldhauser.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to update you on the efforts of United States Africa Command. I'm also honored this morning to be here with General Votel and Assistant Secretary Wheelbarger to discuss the challenges we face in our respective areas of responsibility. I would like to begin this morning by remembering the soldier we lost on the continent during operations in Somalia this past year. I offer my sincere condolences to the family of Staff Sergeant Alexander Conrad. We honor his commitment, service, and dedication to duty. We also honor the sacrifice of our African partners who paid the ultimate price advancing peace and development across the African continent. Additionally, we thank our families, our service members, our civilian workforce, especially those who serve on the continent, oftentimes in remote locations, for their professionalism and commitment to AFRICOM's mission. 2019 marks the beginning of AFRICOM's second decade as a combatant command. As we enter this period, we've adapted our strategy for Africa based on updated national guidance, which includes the President's 2017 National Security Strategy and the Secretary of Defense's 2018 National Defense Strategy. Specifically, the National Defense Strategy has shaped the focus of the armed services, outlining broad guidance to enhance readiness for high-end combat while instructing the combatant commands, among other things, to strengthen alliances and attract new partners. The recently released U.S. Strategy toward Africa, the Department of Defense strategy for Africa, and the National Strategy for Counterterrorism refocused our whole-of-government approach in the era of great power competition to advance U.S. influence and maintain strategic access across the globe. Taken comprehensively, the overall U.S. strategic interests in Africa are very clear. Support the U.S. whole-of-government efforts to address security challenges, leverage partnerships to prevent transnational threats from overwhelming African governments or endangering U.S. interests, maintain strategic access and advance American influence, including economic opportunities, counter violent extremist organizations, and protect U.S. citizens and the homeland. To underscore the strategy for disrupting extremists, we remain committed to synchronizing our kinetic authorities. Persistent pressure on al-Shabaab, ISIS, and the al-Qaeda-associated groups remains necessary to prevent the destabilization of African nations. U.S. strategic interests on the continent cannot be solely advanced through the use of military force alone. AFRICOM uses the military tool in concert with diplomacy and development in order to negate the drivers of conflict and create opportunity for the African citizens. In Somalia, we work closely with the ambassador, now permanently located in Mogadishu, and the USAID mission director to help the Somalis assume responsibility for their own security and prosperity. In Libya, our counterterrorism commitment supports the U.S. Chargé, who works closely with the international community to prevent civil conflict and facilitate the political reconciliation process. Additionally, our engagements, exercises, and activities throughout Africa are designed to increase U.S. influence, strengthen local security forces, and ensure our status as the preferred security partner. For example, in East Africa, our programs continue to modernize partner security forces, as in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, who export security and contribute forces to the African Union mission in Somalia. In North Africa, we have seen significant return on investment with Tunisia and Morocco, demonstrating the capacity to absorb advanced U.S. programs and lead the security-related exercises and operations. AFRICOM provides training, advice, and assistance to the Western African nations, which make up the G5 Sahel Force, as well as to the multinational Joint Task Force working to contain violent extremism and secure the borders within the Lake Chad Basin countries. Our partner networks and influence ensures access for U.S. forces in times of crisis to protect U.S. personnel and facilities, such as in Djibouti, a location with strategic significance to multiple combatant commands. In conclusion, the most important use of the U.S. military tool on the African continent is when our engagements emphasize relationships, capacity building, and professionalism. Our activities go beyond military maneuvers and tactics. They focus on a range of professional values, such as respect for the rule of law, human rights, and the integration of gender perspectives. I am proud to lead a team of professionals who have built strong and trusting relationships with African partners, the U.S. interagency, and the international community to foster security, stability, and prosperity in Africa. On behalf of the service members, civilian employees, and the families of United States Africa Command, thank you for your support, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you here this morning.
Thank you all very much. When we get into the questions, this has come up. We try to keep it to 5 minutes. And I apologize to the witnesses. If we hit the 5-minute mark, I'll try and cut you off. If there's a question you haven't answered, sometimes you can submit that for the record. But we try to keep it to 5 minutes, both in terms of the answers and the questions. And with that, we'll start with Ms. Loria.
Well, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And thank you, Ms. Wilbarger, for mentioning the Middle East maritime domain, because that's what I would like to focus on today. Approximately 5 years ago, the Navy implemented the Optimized Fleet Response Plan, which resulted in more surge capability but less deployed on-station time for our carriers, basically switching from a 24-month cycle to a 36-month cycle. And General Votel, in FY 2019, was your request for carrier strike group presence met?
Congresswoman, no, we did not have carriers all the time that we would like them, and so we had to work solutions that included other platforms and other coalition partners to help meet those requirements.
So, understanding that this is, an unclassified hearing, could you quantify just maybe 1/2, 1/5, 1/3, approximately the amount of carrier presence you received versus what you requested?
Congressman, I'll take that for the record so I can give you a precise answer.
Okay. So you alluded to this a little bit in your previous comment, but was your allocation for carrier presence sufficient to meet your ongoing security needs that you have in the region?
It is, the presence that we have had has been sufficient to support the ongoing operations that we have been supporting in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria in conjunction with our land-based capabilities.
And would you feel that they meet the requirements that you have for maintaining maritime presence in the AOR?
In some cases, we have been challenged in these areas of continuing to do that. So this again is something that we have to work with our coalition partners on to help offset this at times when we will not have the presence that we would like, and we look to use our coalition partners to help do that. And I think we've successfully done that.
So pivoting back to the impacts on you as a combatant commander of the optimized fleet response plan, and the idea that it creates more surge capability versus more deployed capability, as a combatant commander, which of those is more important to you?
Well, I think certainly in CENTCOM, a key part of our responsibilities is assurance, and we do that through our presence and engagements and other things we do, and deterrence against influences in the region that would pursue malign activity. So those to me are the most important aspects that they provide for us. And of course, directly supporting the freedom of navigation and commerce through the critical choke points that exist in the CENTCOM area of responsibility.
So, to leverage on your comments, the surge capability that's being created by the optimized fleet response plan, where the carriers are, for the most part, remaining CONUS, but available on demand, obviously adding a transit time to report to your theater, is limiting some of the capability you might have to respond in a contingency?
Well, I think we're early on in the concept right now. So, I know the department has successfully done this in other combatant commands. I've benefited from some of that capability, residually being able to operate in my area and come down in my area. So, we will look for opportunities. We are looking for opportunities where we can apply that concept as well. So, I think we have a ways to go yet to before we declare that this is not a concept that works. I think we've seen it work in other combatant commands, and we look forward to trying it in CENTCOM as well.
Okay. So finally, just to wrap up, do you feel confident in your ability to execute contingency plans, potentially from our adversaries who might become a maritime threat within the region, based off the limited carrier presence that you've had over the last year?
Congresswoman, I do.
Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Walls.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you. I especially want to thank your families who truly bear the burden of your service. You love what you do, I know, but they truly have to bear the burden. It's a team effort. So I think broadly what the National Defense Strategy is trying to do, and it's a tough one, is how do we deal with a metastasizing Islamic extremist threat, peer competitors, rogue states, Iran, North Korea, overlaid with $22 trillion in debt. And what strikes me about your AOR is that it really is the cross-section. It's really the confluence of China's One Belt, One Road, of Russia's Middle East, a push into the Middle East, of Iran's hegemony, and of course the heart of the extremist threat. In reading your written testimony, what concerns me a bit, when I want to ask you about specifically as it comes to a couple of the theaters, is just kind of language in there of shifting to being a supporting command, of doing more with less, of doing with less resources, particularly in the AFRICOM AOR. And while of course we do, and this committee needs to help you invest in those near peer or peer, I'd say now, adversaries, I'm very worried of the pendulum swinging too far. and taking our eye off the ball on this extremist threat that is maybe on its back foot, but is absolutely not defeated. In looking at your testimony to the Senate, I think you agree that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, ISIS in particular, may be defeated as a caliphate, but not as a movement. In fact, I'd argue, and tell me if you disagree, that movement is growing and metastasizing, particularly across North Africa, and absolutely can return to threaten the United States again. So looking at Afghanistan in particular, with half the world's terrorist organizations emanate, and where the 9/11 attacks emanate, and reading recent reporting of a withdrawal based on a 5-year timeline as part of General Miller and Sal Khalilzad's negotiations, I feel like I'm getting transported back to 2009 with President Obama announcing withdrawal timelines. Do you, General Votel, think timelines as part of our strategy is a good idea? And have you been consulted on that timeline? Is that your best military advice?
I think, Congressman, I think most of us would say that these decisions have to be based more on conditions and on specific times. But I am certainly aware of the ongoing discussions here, and have provided my advice. My advice is that any decision to reduce forces in Afghanistan should be done in full consultation with our coalition partners, and of course the government of Afghanistan. It should pivot off political progress and the reconciliation.
Do the conditions on the ground now merit a withdrawal? And that's both a question for you and for you, Ms. Wilberg.
Congressman, we've not been directed to withdrawing. There are no orders to withdraw anything. I know
but
in
your advice is, do the conditions merit a withdrawal, a reduction of forces? But whether it's the conditions of the Afghan army, which I would think we would agree is not ready to stand on its own, or the battlefield conditions from a CT perspective?
Well, it certainly is a function of the conditions on the ground, but it is also a function of the conditions in the political process as well. And so, as I indicated, as I talked about, my best military advice is that we should make decisions based on the political progress.
I'm sorry, General. Just in the interest of time, do the conditions now merit a withdrawal? In your advice, on 4 years at CENTCOM, on your way out.
The political conditions and where we are in the reconciliation right now don't merit that.
Okay. General Waldhauser, I only have a few minutes. If I could ask you for the record to submit where we are on an American citizen, Jeff Woodkey, held hostage in Mali, what assets are being dedicated to find him. I think we owe the families and all American citizens that, where we are. If you could submit that for the record, it would be great. I understand with optimization, you're shifting to a 25% withdrawal in a theater that was already an economy of force, where, again, the Chinese and Russians are increasingly involved, and we have a growing extremist threat. What are you not able to do with that reduction? What risk are we taking?
First of all, Congressman, on the Woodkey issue, I will submit that, and we can talk about it in closed session.
Thank you.
Secondly, with regards to optimization, I know we just have a few seconds left to go here, but I just want to emphasize the fact that optimization on the African continent has to do with counterterrorism strategy only. It's a very small niche. And what we've been directed to do and what we've said we will do are two different things. And moreover, we've been directed to do a cut for the first optimization or adjustment or cut for the first 18 months, which takes us out to June of 2020. And I think the number the Pentagon has used was about 10%. So it's difficult to get into numbers because they move around all the time. But if you say that there's 6,000 military people on the continent today, then that number is roughly close. But in the next 18 months, we'll optimize some conventional forces and some special operations forces, primarily in areas where their work is pretty much done, where they have—
I'm sorry, the gentleman's time has expired. If you summarize, we'll move on to Mr. Golden.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up a little bit on my colleague's questioning about Afghanistan, General Votel, could you tell us, in your opinion, if there were a negotiated withdrawal of U.S. forces without a Taliban-Afghan peace deal that accompanied it, could the Afghan security forces at this time provide for their own security and maintain a stable government without U.S. forces on the ground or air support on the battlefield?
My assessment is the Afghan forces are dependent upon the coalition support that we provide to them.
Thank you. This question is for Assistant Secretary Wheelbarger. It's been widely reported that our government is engaged in peace talks with the Taliban. In your opinion, or have you seen any indication at all that the Taliban is willing to consider expanding talks to include the Afghan government at this time?
I'll preface by saying that Assistant Secretary Shriver actually is responsible for Afghanistan, Pakistan. I do cover NATO, so it's very important for me to follow so we can stay in close alignment with our RSM colleagues. All indications I have is that the negotiations are proceeding with in a positive direction. I think we all agree that it's important if we're going to reach the level of agreement where the insurgency is no longer a concern, it's going to have to involve an Afghan-Taliban reconciliation.
So to summarize, given the current security situation on the ground, without, let's say, tri-party negotiations and a settled peace deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban to include the United States, we're not on let's say, a roadway to getting to withdrawal.
I would have to, again, I would want to defer to my colleagues who cover this specifically, but I do think that we are seeing that this is an opportunity that we have not necessarily seen before, and that we will continue to, the military is poised to continue supporting the efforts of the reconciliation talks.
Thank you. Just shifting gears a little bit General Waldhauser, Semper Fi. Very good to see you, sir. Last year, you testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee that climate change was causing some security challenges in Africa and the Sahel. It's been about a year, and I saw some recent reporting with ICRC noting that temperatures are rising about 1.5 times faster than the global average, and I think in this region, we got about 50 million people who depend upon livestock and therefore need land. And I think your comment was that you were seeing grasslands receding on average about a mile per year, which was pretty significant. I just want to give you the opportunity here about a year later to follow up on that testimony and tell us how you perceive the evolving situation in the Sahel, what impact climate change is having on the security situation in the region in regards to competition over scarce resources, and how does this impact the mission of AFRICOM? What kind of steps are you having to take in order to ensure that we don't see conflict?
The climate change situation continues. The area between, in the Sahel, between the desert to the north and the savanna in the south, the grasslands, those continue to recede. And this causes problems between the farmers and the herders. And oftentimes governments aren't able to establish control or laws or legislate that particular situation. So consequently, this becomes an opportunity for armed engagement within the various farmer-herder populations. Secondly, so that's on the security side, if you will. Secondly, on the humanitarian side, the issue of food insecurity and displaced personnel is a huge issue which continues. So this climate issue has some security aspects, both kinetically, if you will, as well as humanitarian.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Chairman, and General Waldhauser and General Votel. Thank you for always, during your long and very successful careers, setting the highest standards and being an outstanding example of not only keeping those standards, but raising the bar. As someone who served a few days in uniform myself, I am proud as I look at what kind of leadership the young soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen have today. So thank you for your long service. A little over a decade ago, having had the opportunity to sit in some interesting meetings in places like Fallujah or others, and participating with various entities, tribes who wanted to come and talk to American military leadership. Could you, if you will, describe, I have in the memories in my mind what those meetings were like. Could you describe what security cooperation and coalition building, give a couple examples in your arena, for some of our folks who maybe haven't sat in one of those meetings?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll take a shot at that first. You know, we are building an airstrip on a Nigerian compound in Agadez in northern Nigeria. Niger. And one of the first times I went up there, I met with the local population because they were very interested in what was going on. And you have a very, very diverse group of individuals who have different and sometimes overreach in terms of expectations about what we can do with them. And so not only to build the airfield there, we have a significant civil military engagement program so that we work with the schools there to provide desks. We work with the medical people there to provide extra care, and we do things like find children who are lost in the middle of the desert to help that population. So the bottom line is your actions speak louder than words, and sometimes with diverse groups, small things go a long way, and it's important they understand the capabilities and limitations, and their expectations therefore can be met. Thank you.
Congressman, I'd add that one of the most successful coalition efforts that we have in CENTCOM is our coalition maritime force that operates in the waters of the Gulf and in some cases outside of the Gulf. And these involve nations in the region, and in fact some nations from outside of the region who contribute people and ships to the combined maritime force and help us conduct operations that are focused on counter-piracy, on combating terrorism, and on providing security in these critical waterways. And in all of these cases, we have 3 subordinate combined maritime forces that operate under our naval commander in the region. These are all led by coalition partners, and these are all deeply valued relationships and missions by our coalition partners, and the authorities and the resources that are provided to us by Congress to maintain these things, I think are being very well used, and it is one of the ways we help make them more resilient, more capable of addressing their own security concerns. So, of many coalition efforts, this is one that stands out in my mind.
Would either of you, just using Djibouti as an example, in an unclassified way, explain why we're there in that particular place, and also what other countries might be exerting a presence there now that maybe weren't there a while ago?
The strategic geography of Djibouti is significant to our national strategies. And although it's in the AFRICOM AOR, because as Djibouti is, various COCOMs, to include CENTCOM, utilize that location. CENTCOM, SOCOM, EUCOM, TRANSCOM. So this is a very strategic location for us. And I would tell you this issue of either optimization or being able to share assets. CENTCOM and AFRICOM share assets. In this particular case, ISR assets, attack aircraft assets, and we use Djibouti as a hub that allows us to be more efficient in use of some of our material.
No, I would absolutely agree, and I think it also makes better use of our resources. When we're able to shift resources back and forth across our combatant command boundaries, I think we're making better use of the resources the American people provide to us, and I think we're actually being more effective in terms of it. So locations like Djibouti, I think, are incredibly important to what's going on. Of course, it sits astride the Bab el-Mandeb, one of the 3 critical choke points. We do see the presence of others in the area. Certainly the Chinese have interests here and are steaming in the waters of the Central Command on a regular basis.
I hate to cut you off, but I know the chairman is going to say my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate you doing that for me. But thank you, Ms. Holland.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and thank you all for being here this morning. Really appreciate it, and thank you for your service to our country. I understand that the framework for the negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban would see Taliban vow to prevent the country from being used as a hub for terrorism in return for a U.S. military withdrawal. While Taliban leaders have recently expressed willingness to acknowledge some fundamental women's rights, I'm deeply concerned that respect for human rights be a core part of the framework for peace. Any negotiated settlement must include respect for human rights and the rights of women in particular. Women's equality is enshrined in the Afghan Constitution, and the women of Afghanistan should have a seat at the negotiating table. General Votel Can you tell me how the framework addresses the rights of women in Afghanistan and how women are being included in the negotiation process, if you can?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So I think at this particular point where we are in the ongoing talks is that Ambassador Khalilzad's efforts are really focused on developing a framework that can lead to inter-Afghan discussions. And this involves, I think, overcoming some obstacles that right now are preventing the Taliban from talking to the government of Afghanistan. But again, Ambassador Khalilzad is working through those issues. And then once those inter-Afghan discussions are commenced, then I think we will have the opportunity to address the issues that you are talking about directly. But I am aware, while these are being led by our Department of State colleagues and Ambassador Khalilzad in particular, I am aware that exactly as you state remains key points that we are interested in ensuring are included in the overall discussions and framework.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to turn now to the Afghan women serving in the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. And if you can answer this question, how many women are currently serving in the Afghan National Army, and how are the challenges in recruitment and retention being addressed? And is that recruitment sustainable?
Congresswoman, I'll take that question for the record so I can provide you a precise response.
Thank you so much. And this question will go to Assistant Secretary Wilbarger. Thank you so much for being here. Can you tell me how your office is pursuing the implementation of the United States National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security?
I don't directly cover that issue, so unfortunately I think I'm going to have to take that for the record, and I'll converse with my colleagues who are responsible for it.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd appreciate that, and I yield back my time, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much, and thank you, both of you, for joining my colleagues and congratulating you on your careers. I wish you well in your retirement. Your families deserve some of your time. I'd like to follow up on Mr. Waltz's questions about AFRICOM, if I could. Given the discussions about reducing our footprint there, could you define for me what impact that may have on our counterterrorism effort in Africa, and does that undermine or threaten some of those efforts?
First of all, let me just say that with regards to the terrorism effort, for sure, Somalia and Libya will really there's no impact there. There's no optimization. There's really no cutback. We'll maintain our capability and capacity there. And by the way, those are the two countries on the continent where we have authorities to conduct kinetic operations. In other areas on the continent where we were directed to take a look at this, we looked at the locations where we have been training with partner forces for some time, in some cases 5, 6, 7 years. And so, for the most part, those units are prepared and ready to execute on their own, and they have been for quite some time. So that's where we made the cut in our first tranche, if you will. But moreover, we continue to provide intelligence, we'll continue to provide logistics support, and with partners like the French in Western Africa, we have got a great relationship with them and will maintain that partnership. So, as I said, at the moment, we've been directed to conduct Tranche 1, which takes us out to June of 2020. So that's roughly 300 or so people coming off the continent, half of whom are conventional forces. And so at the moment, we don't see a significant issue there. And whether we'll ever be directed to execute the second half is to be determined. And the final point I would make is what we have told the Secretary is that every one of these decisions will be made individually, and if we feel that it's not in our best interest to do so, we will reclame and push back on the plan that's in place at the moment.
Let me ask you, it may not be appropriate here, but maybe in closed session, to summarize systemic changes that have been made since the incident that happened in Niger, where we had the 4 soldiers lose their life there. It may not be appropriate here, but I think it's appropriate in terms of some form to get some feedback on that. I'd like it because I'm concerned that reduced footprint puts more people at risk. I was in Landstuhl right before the holidays and spoke with an officer there that's working in intelligence. We can't get it where, but frankly, support for him was a long way away. And I'm concerned, given the size of Africa, that we're not putting resources into that we need to deal with that. I guess it lets me pivot to the next question. Maybe it's more, I think for both you and the Secretary, given the increased engagement of China in particular in Africa, both in terms of their investment and with that almost instantaneously comes to military engagement, Do we have enough resources there, both military as well as diplomatic and development resources, to address those concerns? Because I know we deal with counterterrorism, but we have near-peer concerns I think we're overlooking.
Well, I'll start by saying that we definitely see that China's influence in Africa as a key priority for us. And our efforts are multilateral in the sense of we look at all of our activities on the DoD side, whether it be exercises, training missions, military.
Let me interrupt you. I apologize, but he'll be a tough guy on time. The question I have for both of you is, do we have enough resources, both in terms of military, development, and diplomacy, to address the threats we have in Africa, from not just terrorism, but from our near-peer adversaries? That's what I'd like to address. Do we have them? What do we do to get them?
I think particularly on the development and the commercial side, where China has a much more focused capability to bring resources to bear, we are challenged to keep up, and we could, particularly on the non-military side of our government efforts, we should be seeking, and I know the interagency is very focused on finding ways to compete in the private commercial sphere in particular.
What do you think, General?
Very quickly, on the Niger thing, we can talk in closed session, but the bottom line is we've instituted practices and procedures that negate some of the issues that have taken place there in the past, as you referred to. With regards to the Chinese and what's important for AFRICOM, in the Defense Department strategy on China, it specifically states in there that we can expect to get no more resources and maybe less. So that's fine. That's the umbrella. That's the intent. So my point would be is that we need to we have 6,000 or so conventional forces plus special operations forces on the continent today. We need to maintain that threshold force in order to accomplish what you just described.
Do you believe that's sufficient?
It's adequate.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I yield back my time.
They would have to have a dictionary definition between what's the difference between sufficient and adequate. I'll let you guys discuss that later. Ms. Escobar.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our panel. Thanks especially General Votel and General Waldhauser for your service. Please thank the men and women who serve with you for their service as well on our behalf. I am especially concerned about something that the chairman mentioned in his opening statements about how our posture meets the threats, and obviously all of us here are interested and concerned about that, and what risks exactly, as he said, we are willing to accept. And to the question that just came before me and to the definition of adequate, I'd like to expand a little bit on that. At what point does it become inadequate, and what are the risks that we will have to accept if we don't move out of the adequate phase?
Congresswoman, one of the challenges we have on the African continent is trying to accurately characterize the threat that we're up against. So, for example, in optimization, one of the reasons why the department gave us the optimization task is because the threats that we are working against aren't necessarily a threat to the homeland and may not be a threat to the region overall. Because many of these groups, you have the intersection of jihadist philosophy with crime, historical influence, criminal activity, shipping of weapons, drugs, people, cattle, and so forth. So because these groups may hang out a shingle and say we're with ISIS today, they may or may not have the intent or capability to attack outside their particular part of the country. So that's one of the challenges that we have. And so when to come more in compliance with the National Defense Strategy, to get more in line for depth to dwell time, if you look at some of the threats on the African continent, sometimes even though they may call themselves Al-Qaeda or ISIS, sometimes it's difficult to say they are a threat to the homeland.
Well, and last year the Pentagon announced a reduction in forces to the AFRICOM region by 10%, obviously over time. But what will that reduction mean?
So again, I want to emphasize that 10% reduction is in the counterterrorism forces only. And so the conventional forces that are on the continent every day, right now, conducting, for example, we have a ship in port in Algeria today. We have numerous small engagements across the continent. We have exercises that are ongoing that are conducted by our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps components. We need to make sure those things maintain. We need to make sure we have threshold force for that. And then as we continue to observe and watch the threat from these counterterrorism groups, if we believe they're at a point where they've grown and their intent is perhaps more along threats to the United States, then we have to go back and ask for that. So in sum, I want to make sure that when the line that we're walking away from the continent or we're leaving the continent, you have to remember that the task we were given was counterterrorism forces only. We've tried to take forces that have been involved in working with units that have been trained for quite some time, and that their threat to the homeland is questionable at best.
Thank you. Now, despite opening up a military base in Djibouti, some analysts say that China does not intend to grow its military presence in Africa, but rather use telecommunications, infrastructure projects, and trade as their primary tools of influence on the continent. How will these avenues of influence change our ability to work with African partners?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that in AFRICOM, we're the only place really on the planet where China has an overseas base, in Djibouti, as we've discussed. And we've talked about why that location is important for us and the challenges that it brings to AFRICOM, and as well as the other combatant commanders. One of our key tasks is to maintain influence and gain influence vis-a-vis the Chinese. And so we want to make sure we're the partner of choice. And we'll do that militarily through our training, through our equipment sales, because of the quality and so forth. But I think one of the things that needs to be done for the whole of government approach, which is what the Chinese do very well, is they work at the relationship. The number of high-level officials who come to visit just to say hello and just to work at the relationship is very high, and that's very meaningful to the Africans. The Africans don't want to be in the middle of great power competition between the U.S. and China. They want to be our partner of choice. But but they'll make decisions in their own best interest at times. But I think one of the things we have to do from a whole government approach is, if we want to be the partner of choice, we've got to work at the relationship with high-level visits and engagements.
Thank you so much, General, for your testimony today, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to meet you. I know this is your final hearing, and so I feel very fortunate. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter for the record a piece by Tom Jocelyn and Bill Roggio, The Costs of Withdrawal from Afghanistan, from
Without
December
objection,
22nd.
so ordered.
Also, Al-Qaeda continues to view Afghanistan as a safe haven, by the same authors from the Long War Journal. And a third piece by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, I was ambassador to Afghanistan, and this deal is a surrender.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. General Votel, I appreciate your determination and your commitment in your testimony and today to talking about how important it is that we be guided by conditions on the ground. But I have to say, when I look at the situation in Afghanistan and the policy that I'm afraid we're pursuing now here, it looks like we're aggressively setting those conditions aside, aggressively ignoring the conditions on the ground. In particular, the discussions that are underway that both you and Assistant Secretary Will Barger have referenced that Ambassador Khalil Azad is leading. I think you mentioned them as a path to progress, and then Assistant Secretary Will Barger said that they were going in a positive direction. We seem to be pursuing the same fantasy that we did in the Obama administration, which is that al-Qaeda is somehow distinct from the Taliban. When I look at what's happened, when I look at the fact that Ayman Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, has sworn an oath of allegiance to the Taliban. More recently, Ayman Zawahiri, the same leader of al-Qaeda, claimed that the Taliban's resurrected Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan would be, quote, the nucleus of a new caliphate. So when I look at the situation there and I look at the extent to which we are dealing with the very entity that attacked us on 9/11, none of us want what the president has called endless wars. However, it would be far worse if we handed a victory to our jihadist enemies. And it would be, God forbid, far worse if we had another mass casualty attack in the United States. So I wonder, General Votel, if you could point me to anything that the Taliban has said or done to either renounce violence, to abandon their alliance with al-Qaeda, or to say that they'll abide by the Constitution of Afghanistan, that should give us any hope that these talks are anything but a fantasy.
Well, they haven't made any of those statements, Congresswoman, as you know. But again, as I tried to cover in my opening statement here, we are very early in the process of this. There have been no agreements from either side. We have not given anything up, and they have not given anything up.
So, General, is there anything you see that gives you confidence that it would be your best military advice that we could, in fact, negotiate any kind of agreement that you could count on the Taliban to uphold?
I think the fact that we are actually having discussions is a point that we have not reached in the 18 years we've been involved in this.
No, well, General, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we actually did have discussions that during the Obama administration, Secretary Clinton initially set these conditions and then completely abandoned them. And, you know, I don't have to tell you the history when we released the prisoners from Guantanamo in exchange for Bergdahl. So we've gone down this path before, but my concern is even if, let's say for the sake of argument, that you believed that those negotiations could lead someplace, that we could in fact be doing the best we could for our national security by talking to the Taliban, who are inextricably linked with al-Qaeda, the organization that attacked us on 9/11. Would it be your best military advice that withdrawing forces in the middle of that would in fact help to increase our credibility?
Congresswoman, we have remained very focused on the terrorism and counterterrorism mission that we have.
But specifically the withdrawal
And we
of
could
forces.
we could withdraw forces and not have an impact on our counterterrorism mission.
That's right, but
against,
General,
Al Qaeda or any other groups.
Thank you, General. But you mentioned making sure that we had the maximum military pressure on the Taliban and on al-Qaeda. And I fail to understand how it could be the situation that announcing withdrawal of forces is maintaining the maximum military pressure. An additional question would be, how is it conceivably possible that a negotiation that actively leaves out the very government that we say we're trying to help to encourage and sustain would lead us in the right direction?
It is not leaving out the government. Ambassador Khalilzad is well engaged with the government of Afghanistan.
But the Taliban continues to refuse to talk to the government of Afghanistan.
And this is the purpose of the framework discussions that are underway right now, Congresswoman, to get to that point.
Thank you, General. I remain very concerned that we are headed down an extremely dangerous path. We'll continue this in the classified setting, but this would be, were we to leave, a jihadist victory for the very forces that attacked us on 9/11. And while we've got to ensure that we're engaged in countering the great power conflict and the threats we face, we cannot go down the path of ignoring the fact that these were the folks that provided safe haven to al-Qaeda for the attacks on 9/11. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hill.
Thank you, Generals and Ms. Wilbarger, for being here. I also want to give a shout out to the fellow Centurion in the room. I think we're the only two Katies from Saugus who are in Washington, D.C. right now. So I want to dig in a little bit more on the focus on the great power competition. You all have mentioned the increased engagement in Africa and the Middle East by our near-peer adversaries, including referencing the regions as the crossroads of global competition with Russia and China. So, General Waldhauser, you mentioned in your report that Russia is actively involved in Libya and is invoking Gaddafi-era relationships. Reporting also indicates that Russia is supporting the Libyan National Army. How is this challenging our efforts to help the current Libyan government and our counterterrorism efforts in the country? And what are Russia's aims in Libya overall?
We have three missions in Libya. One of them is the counterterrorism piece, which we have been at for quite some time. We've had, after the liberation of Sirte, if you will, where we had over almost 500 strikes, we've had 13 strikes in the last 2 years. It was CT effort, but we maintain that. That's the first thing. The second thing we do, one of our missions is to prevent civil war, and we do that by not going one side or the other. And the third one is support the political process. And so what the Russians have done is overtly they've supported the UN, GNA, President Siraj framework. But behind the scenes, there's no doubt about the fact they've supported the LNA with all kinds of equipment, people, training, and the like. And they've supported Haftar, who has moved now from the east to the west and essentially has taken a lot of real estate to get into a good position for leverage for diplomatic talks.
And why would they want to do that?
Well, I think when the music stops, they want to be on the winning side. And right now, you know, Siraj has been the president for over 2 years. He's been a good partner for us. Special Representative Salome is trying to get to elections by the end of the year. And it's unclear whether Haftar would run for elections, but he's going to be involved in some way, shape, or form. So when the music stops, the Russians want to be on the side if he gets in.
But what strategic advantage would that give them?
It gives them influence, and it gives them influence in a key location in the southern Med, on the southern part of NATO, if you will, and it allows them then to reinvigorate some old Gaddafi-era contracts in the oil field, weapon sales, and the like. So there's a strategic interest for them to be behind both sides, but primarily, really, Haftar.
So it's about resources and access to being closer to the southern border of
Correct, and influence as well.
Okay, great. Not great, but thank you. You also discussed the Russian efforts in Central African Republic, which leads me to ask, what are the Russian objectives on the continent more broadly? Why there? What are the other areas where they're?
What the Russians are doing in the Central African Republic is very concerning because they have the paramilitary group, the Wagner Group, who's heavily involved there, not only in training, but also in influence at the highest levels of the government, to include the president. And meanwhile, they've been able to work the situation so they can have mineral extraction and so forth, gold, et cetera, to generate revenue as well. And so this model is very concerning in that if you bring in a paramilitary group, they influence the government, they extract resources. This is very concerning if that model would be applied in another country.
Thank you. General Votel, in your assessment, how did the Russians react to the president's December announcement to withdraw from Syria?
I think they viewed it positively.
The Russians viewed that decision positively.
They did, Congresswoman.
Can you describe what advantage Russia gains with our withdrawal from Syria and proposed withdrawal from Syria and Afghanistan?
Well, I think what they looked at this as an opportunity to fill the void that we had provided and the support to the partners that we work with on the ground there. So they looked to gain and perpetuate what the Assad regime is doing.
And again, why? What does this do for us? What harm does this potentially cause us and our allies? How does this help Russia as a whole as it's trying to regain its power?
Well, it makes Russia a bigger player in this area, and as we move, albeit slowly, towards some kind of end state in Syria, it puts Russia more in the driver's seat in terms of what that solution might be, and of course it solidifies their presence in the Middle East in this critical part of the Levant right here. So I think that is an important objective of theirs.
So to put it very bluntly, the president's proposals directly allow Russia to gain more influence in the Middle East, potentially endangering us and our allies?
No, I don't think that's what I said. I said our withdrawal from there gave them the opportunity to fill the void. Obviously, things that would come after that would increase their influence in pursuing some kind of political settlement. But it would certainly give them the ability to be in a better position.
So, again, the proposal to withdraw troops from Syria and Afghanistan provides an opportunity for Russia to gain additional power and to potentially grow as a global threat.
Lady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Going back and forth. I do want to ask one quick follow-up on that. As of right now, is there any specific plan on the withdrawal? And you can tell me what's classified and what's not. A timeline. I know the president announced it in a tweet, as I said in my opening remarks. I don't think that's a particularly wise way to set a policy. And then we sort of set the policy after he tweeted. But what is the timeline, if there is one, on withdrawal from Syria, and what do the numbers look like?
Well, I look forward to talking about this in the classified session. But what I would say is that what is driving withdrawal, of course, is our mission, which is defeat of ISIS, and so that is our principal focus. And then behind that is making sure that we protect our forces, that we don't withdraw in a manner that increases the risk to our forces going through this. So there is not pressure on me to meet a specific date at this particular time, and I look forward to talking in some more details in a closed session.
No, I'm sorry. We can do it in closed session. I just want to make one final, policy political point. What seems to be driving the withdrawal is the president's split-second decision to send out a tweet saying we're going to get out of Syria. Okay. Now, I hear what you're saying in terms of what you're working on, but in terms of the public perception, the international perception, is that prior to that tweet, it wasn't planned. He sent it out. Now we're responding. So I take your point, and that's obviously the argument we want to make, is that what's driving our military decisions is military necessity. It does not appear that way in this case, given the way the president has communicated. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Votel, you've already heard a great deal of skepticism expressed about Special Envoy Khalil Azad's negotiations with the Taliban for reconciliation. Why shouldn't we be skeptical?
Congressman, in my view, we have come further in the last 6 months than we have at any time in the last 18 years. Since the announcement of the South Asia strategy by our president, the government of Afghanistan, the president of Afghanistan has announced that he's willing to meet. We've had a ceasefire. The first time we've done that, both sides did that. It was short, but it gave a glimpse of what could be. And the meetings and the sessions that have taken place over the last 5 or 6 months, I think, have moved this further along than it is. It is a difficult problem. We are still at the front end of this. I acknowledge that, and we have a ways to go. But the Taliban has come to the table. We've seen Pakistan play a more helpful role in helping that occur. So to me, these are things that we have not seen in the past that we are now seeing.
I appreciate that, but with all due respect, the vagueness of what we hear about timelines and conditions, it paints a skeptical picture for me and so many others, and wondering if this path will lead anywhere. But yet, in a rose-colored world, if these negotiations were successful, if there was an agreement that was signed between us and the Taliban, what would happen at that point in that rose-colored world?
I think if you look at what I think winning in Afghanistan means, it means two things, Congressman. It means a negotiated settlement between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban, and it also means safeguarding U.S. national interests, particularly ensuring that this country, this region, can't be used to attack our homeland. So that would have to be satisfied as part of any overall agreement here in terms of that, and I think that is a lot of the nuance of the ongoing discussions that are taking place right now.
Is ISIS-K potentially a threat to the homeland?
I think ISIS Khorasan does have ideations focused on external operations towards our homeland. Yes.
General, some of your predecessors have testified before this committee before and articulated a sustained presence strategy in Afghanistan. Would you agree with that approach? Maybe articulate what that means?
I think as long as there is a terrorist threat, whether it comes from Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other group that perpetrates threats against our country, I think we have to ensure that they're either through our own presence or through whatever other arrangements we can make that we can address that particular threat.
So therefore, a sustained presence in Afghanistan in some shape or fashion would allow us to combat that ongoing presence of ISIS-K or other threats that might be posed from Afghanistan.
That would certainly be one way of doing it, Congressman.
What would a sustained presence look like?
Well, I think this might be a better discussion for a closed session here to give you a little bit more detail. But I think it looks a lot like it looks right now. It looks like making sure we got partners on the ground that we can operate with. It looks like we have the right collection assets in, so we can keep an eye on this. And it means that we have the right unique capabilities from a U.S. standpoint to address this particular and keep the pressure on this network like we have been doing.
General, when should the American people and members of this committee expect a better defined idea of the timeline of these negotiations between Special Envoy Khalil Azad and the Taliban?
I think I would have to refer you to the Department of State on that, since that's who Ambassador Khalil Azad works for, and they would probably be better to provide some type of timeline, if there is one.
So no reasonable expectation of when that timeline would be?
Congressman, it's underway right now. I mean, it is proceeding, and it is a complex environment. And in my estimation, I think Ambassador Khalil Azad is doing the very best that he can to move this forward. And our job, my job as a CENTCOM commander, is to make sure he has the military support to move forward on that objective. Our end state here is reconciliation. That is the end state of the President's South Asia strategy, and that's what we're focused on. So the whole of our efforts is supporting Ambassador Khalil Azad.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I had hoped today that I could eliminate some of my skepticism, but the vagueness of the nature of these negotiations and what I've heard today leave me even more skeptical than before. I'm not sure that Special Envoy Khalil Azad's best that he can do is good enough. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thanks to our witnesses. I certainly know, Ms. Wilbarger, exactly how it feels to be exactly in your shoes. And to both generals, I've really enjoyed my time working with you. And General Votel, since you're so short, I think it's worth noting you are one of the most creative, out-of-the-box thinkers we have in our senior leadership. Your career defines what it means to fight in the post-9/11 world. And I think the American public will probably never know what you did to help us protect ourselves from terrorist threats. So I thank you for everything you've done. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take advantage of this opportunity with you, with just 3 weeks left, to ask you kind of some bigger picture questions on how the U.S. fights in the post-9/11 era. The theory of the case for me is that we cannot fight global threats without a global coalition, that without partners and allies, our ability to protect ourselves is at least diminished, at best diminished, and at worst leaves us less safe. So can you just walk me through what you believe happens if allies and partners are not providing support to us in these global fights in your region?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So very clearly, we are very dependent upon our coalition partners, not just for basing and access in the region, but certainly for the additional capabilities that they take. We bring a lot. The United States brings a lot to these operations, but we don't bring everything. And so many of the unique capabilities that we rely on in these coalitions do come from our coalition partners, whether it's medical, whether it's sustainment, whether it's training, whether it is advising. They augment, they supplement, they complement the things that we are doing. And so that's an important aspect of it. The other thing is it brings with the coalition aspect brings with it the will of the world, if you will, or the will of the coalition. So it is more than just one nation who is standing up for something. In the case of Iraq and Syria, it is 79 nations and international organizations that are saying, we are focused on this particular mission right here. So to me, that is one of the most important aspects of the coalition approach.
So many of the members of this committee went on a bipartisan congressional delegation to the Munich Security Conference. We heard in real time from our allies their deep, deep concern with the way that that the U.S. and the administration was handling, informing them about our plans in the world, particularly, as was referenced, the tweet to get out of Syria when many of them are fighting with us in Syria. In your experience, if we alienate our allies and make it politically difficult for them to join with us in these operations, what happens to the quality of our operations? Do they go up or do they go down? And kind of, I know General Mattis was really clear about this in his final letter, but if you could just talk to us about, the quality of our operations if these partners and allies just say no to joining with us.
Well, Congresswoman, I think it certainly makes it more difficult to pursue some of these missions without the partnerships that we depend on out here. And as I've already mentioned, we lose capabilities, we lose some of the sustainment that comes along with our operations there. So I think it makes it much more difficult doing these things without partners.
Mm-hmm. A number of us wrote a letter, a bipartisan letter to the president asking that he reconsider his decision to fully pull out of Syria. A number of us are very happy to see that a small force is going to be remaining there. We all take note when you say that ISIS, while the caliphate has certainly been depleted, that ISIS has largely gone to ground, that they have not had a change of heart in how they feel. Tell me, if you could, in an unclassified setting, what you believe the likelihood is that we will, with the small force that we have staying behind, ability to keep them suppressed, at least from returning at least a piece of that caliphate.
I am confident in this, and I think we have to look at the force not just as U.S. forces that retain on the ground, but other coalition forces. We need to look at our Syrian Democratic Force partners that number 60,000, and then we need to look at our over-the-horizon capabilities that we can bring to bear. And as we go through the planning of this, we are looking at all of those capabilities. And so, as I mentioned, this is ongoing right now. But I think by looking at all those different pools of forces and capabilities that we have, we will have the capabilities we need to do the mission we've been asked to do.
Thank you. And to both generals, congratulations on your retirement. Well earned, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Waldhauser, I have a number of constituents who contribute to the Train and Equip mission in Africa. Can you share with us the circumstances where we've been most successful at moving the needle of the capabilities of our partner nations, and then where are there places where we haven't made as many strides as we would have hoped?
Well, I think one example that I always use is in Tunisia, where the whole revolution began and so forth. And over the past few years, they have done a tremendous job to essentially restructure their entire military towards a threat that's relevant to them. And they've been a willing partner. They've been able to absorb a lot of institutional level guidance and training. So they've been a success story as well. And I think in other places, in even like Cameroon, for example, with the challenges there with the Anglophone region and the like, the Beer Force has been a good counterterrorism partner, and they have progressed to the point where they are operating on their own and so forth. And I would just mention that as part of that, the whole law of war, the whole battlefield ethics piece, that's always a part of the training and equipping that we do. And so we have programs across the continent, these 333 programs where we'll put equipment in the various countries, whether it's Djibouti or Somalia or Burkina Faso. These are very, very important to us. So those are a couple of examples where we've had success.
And where have we not met our expectations regarding capabilities of partner nations?
Well, without singling out specific nations, I think the point is that when we embark on these engagements, we have to make sure we understand what the country can absorb, and we can't do things or expect things if they don't have the institutional capacity to deal with a logistical train, to deal with sourcing and so forth.
Should I make much of the fact that you didn't identify many Central African nations among the successes?
Well, the Central African nations that we work with, to a large degree, our train, advise, assist, and equip piece is probably not as robust in other places. I mean, the countries that we deal with, to a large degree, have the terrorism threat, because one of the key things is to fight that threat over there and keep it over there. And our engagements with other countries, we take our cues from State Department, too. If there's issues in terms of law of war violations or governmental problems, we sometimes take our cues from State Department with regards to how much we engage.
It's very illuminating. General Votel, is Yemen a failed state?
Yes, I do consider Yemen a failed state.
Thanks. I'll yield the remaining time to General Bacon.
And I appreciate the leadership and your careers. Congratulations on your retirement, and thanks to all three of you being here today. I just want to add my skepticism as well on our negotiations with the Taliban. They continue to be closely aligned with ISIS, Al-Qaeda. They've continue to murder thousands of people in Afghanistan. And I think it looks terrible when we're negotiating with them without the government of Afghanistan. So I just wanted to publicly state that. In Syria, what are we going to do with the 800 or so detainees I've been hearing about that are from ISIS? General Votel.
Well, this is a matter for our Department of State and Department of Justice to work with international partners. As the President has said, they need to go back to their nations where they can be properly prosecuted right here. The Syrian Democratic Forces are performing a service for the world by holding these foreign terrorist fighters right now, and they need to go home where they can be dealt with properly. So that is the principal mechanism that we are pursuing right now.
Yeah, it would be a terrible development if they get released in one way or the other way. I've said it'd be a threat to us and Europe and beyond. In Yemen, are we still seeing evidence of Iran arming the Houthi rebels?
Absolutely, Congressman.
And when was the last time we saw Scud missile launches or any other kind of ballistic missile launch into Saudi Arabia? Because I think that's not being widely reported that was going on, and that's been part of the reason the Saudis are taking actions the way they have.
We've seen a decrease in ballistic missile launches, and there's some reasons for that we can talk about in the closed session. But we've have seen an increase in unmanned aerial systems, and again, this at the hand of Iran providing these advanced capabilities to the Houthi rebels.
In our political debate on how to support Saudi Arabia, whether to or whether or not, that is just a forgotten part of what is going on with Iran, helping the rebels, and how they're also attacking the Saudis. And one last question to General Votel. Are we having any success or progress with Pakistan and the safe havens they're providing the Taliban?
We have had, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we have had success with Pakistan. They've been more helpful in terms of bringing the Taliban to the table. As we have requested them, we have seen instances where they have taken action against the safe haven areas. Clearly, there is more they can do, and we have encouraged them to continue to do that, but we have seen some positive indications.
Thank you, and I thank my friend for yielding, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres-Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General Votel and General Waldhauser, so much for your service. Thank you as well, Assistant Secretary Wheelbarger. I specifically appreciate your discussion about coalition building, and Congresswoman Slotkin as well as Congressman Bergman both recognize that need as well. And we also had some discussion about China and their impact on Africa and how that affects potential coalition building. So we've seen China open up the military base in Djibouti, but it appears, and some analysts think, that they're increasing their focus more so on the telecommunications, the infrastructure, and the trade. Do you see those avenues as more of a threat for our engagement with African partners than if China had opened up more military bases, for example, or conducted training or conventional military operations?
That's a very interesting question and complex in several different ways. Obviously, Djibouti is the first overseas Chinese base. I have said before, I don't believe it'll be the last. They're looking for other areas and so forth, especially ports, because what they want to do, to a large degree, the infrastructure they build, ports, roads, bridges, and whatnot, is tied to the extraction, mineral extraction they're conducting in those countries. So consequently, there's a tie there. Now, moreover, their military growth for the future, although unclear, they certainly want to protect those investments. They want to protect the populations and the workers that they have there. So some would say that this was just a first step, and that they're getting many lessons learned, because it's a challenge to have a base in Djibouti from China, and there's a lot of growing pains with that. But they're learning from that, and some would say that, and we have some reports that I could probably go into in the closed session, that they may look to increase their contributions to some of these groups that are in the counterterrorism effort. So I think that in the future, it's very likely that they could increase their military presence. But real quickly on the trade business, you know, when Secretary Tillerson visited there a while back, as the previous Secretary of State, you know, he talked about how the Chinese should be very careful, or the Africans should be very careful about some of the deals they make with the Chinese, because it's no secret about the debt issue in Djibouti that the Chinese own. There's other countries where some of the projects the countries are walking away from because it's either too expensive or they've figured out the deal is really not good for them. And so there are some challenges, but again, those countries need to make those decisions for themselves, and that was one of the issues that the senior, you know, Paul Kagame, who at the time was the AU chairperson, made that point, that these governments can make those decisions for themselves, and our point is, when you make those decisions, just go into them clear-eyed and understand what you're signing on the dotted line when you sign with the Chinese.
Speaking to that clear-eyed aspect, has China operated this way with other regions, and if so, are there additional phases of involvement that we might anticipate?
Well, I think the China, I'll just speak to the African continent. I mean, the Chinese have been there for quite some time. Their investments in infrastructure, they do a great job. They'll build soccer stadiums. They'll do things for the population that, gains and maintains influence. Meanwhile, we do things like Millennium Challenge Corporation powered programs in Senegal or even in Niger, these huge programs over a 5-year period, $437 million in Niger, for example. This is a whole-of-government approach, too, and we need to do a better job of publicizing those things that we're doing on the soft side of power that will help our influence vis-a-vis China.
In my short amount left, I want to switch very quickly to Yemen and touch base about the end of the in-flight refueling Saudi coalition. When did CENTCOM make the decision to end that mission?
We ended that in November of 2018, Congresswoman.
And who made that decision to end it?
That was a request by the Saudis, but it was directed to me by the Secretary of Defense at the time.
Under what authority was CENTCOM operating when the decision was made not to charge over $300 million in U.S. fuel and in-flight refueling services?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And Chairman, I would just ask for a little allowance here so I can address this in a little bit of detail. First off, It is, as the CENTCOM commander, it was my responsibility. I'm responsible for everything that happens within CENTCOM and doesn't happen within CENTCOM. And so when we failed to charge properly on this thing, I accept the responsibility for that on behalf of our command. There are a variety of things that went wrong. Mostly, we ignored our own well-developed protocols and procedures in this case. We identified those problems that we began identifying that last fall and put together a team, cross-agency team, to make sure that we understood what was happening and that we could, we worked through the issue, identified what the costs were, and then delivered those to the appropriate countries. And we will receive full and proper reimbursement for that.
It's a mark of great leader to take responsibility. I deeply appreciate that.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to pull the string on a previous line of questioning. I think it's important because when we talk about NDS implementation, it's easy to focus myopically on Indo-PACOM and EUCOM, and I'm glad that we've had a variety of questions about Chinese influence and access in the CENTCOM and AFRICOM AORs. And I just would ask General Votel, to what extent does the Shanghai International Port Group's agreement regarding the Haifa port in Israel represent a problem for the U.S. military over the long term? We heard some reporting that the U.S. Navy was considering reducing some commitment to Israel. I know that sort of spans a lot of different COCOM authorities there, but just to what extent do you view that as a problem, and what do you think we should do about it?
Congressman, I would remind you that the Haifa port is in Israel and is outside of my area of responsibility. But I do recognize that that does have influences on our area. So we are concerned about that. The fact that there is the great power competitors have access into those ports along the Mediterranean that have very direct access into the region. I think this is a reason for concern.
And can you, both of you, what parts, as you look at the Belt and Road Initiative in your respective AORs, where would it present a difficulty for us in terms of operational access, either in terms of our ability to operate with key partners or new potential access by Chinese forces? Just help flesh that out for us a bit.
Congressman, in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, the principal place we're seeing this is in Pakistan with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is an artery of the One Belt, One Road aspect. And so that is in progress right now. And there is definite Chinese influence in that particular area. So as they develop that land route, what they are attempting to do then, we expect is they will then be looking for ports that they can connect that to, ports in southern Pakistan leading to ports in AFRICOM, and for us it's going to lead to a permanent presence of Chinese military maritime activity in the region that we will need to be concerned with.
So with regards to AFRICOM on the ports, let me just first say that overall, and I'm not an expert in port operations, but the Chinese have equities in ports around the globe. So it's not unique, for example, that they have equities in Israel. It's not unique that they have equities in Djibouti and other places. That's the first point. The second point is, with regards to the Djiboutian Port, this is the maritime piece of the One Belt, One Road initiative. If you come into Djibouti in that part of the country, that part of the continent, up into Africa. So that's a big part of their strategy, and they're trying to tie it together. Inside Djibouti, the port facility there has about 5 or 6 separate ports. The one we're concerned about is the Dorla container port. Last year at this time when I testified, the Djiboutians just took it back over from the Emiratis. The fear is that if the debt issue with Djibouti is not taken care of, that perhaps the Chinese could take that port over. But I can tell you that in conversations that I've had with President Goulet and other leaders have had with President Goulet, they have assured us that that is not going to be the case, that they will make sure that we have access to that particular port, because 98% of logistics effort that we need on the eastern part of Africa, in Somalia, in Djibouti, comes through that port there.
Mm-hmm. And I take your point about, to the extent I understand it, that the Chinese obviously have legitimate economic interests in a variety of ports around the world. But the whole reason we did a comprehensive review of our CFIUS process last year was because the line between legitimate economic interest and CCP-directed espionage and PLA military activity is often very opaque, right? I wonder, do you have conversations with your partners, sort of in the way we have conversations amongst ourselves about CFIUS and foreign investment, about the structures they have in place to analyze Chinese investment and really determine what is legitimate and what isn't in either order.
Well, I can say, and perhaps that's, Katie, you might should take that. I know our country teams and ambassadors do that from the military perspective. We try to make sure that we make the case that we're the best partners and try to give that top cover.
Yeah.
I will most definitely say that is a key point with all of our engagements with the international community, not just in these AORs, but in Europe as well. And I know the previous Congresswoman touched on telecommunications infrastructure. That is a priority of our department right now to highlight the real challenge that we will face both militarily as well if the Chinese build out these 5G networks all over the world. Telecommunications security is sort of a backbone security requirement for all of us. So it is very much a top line in all of our engagements.
Great. I yield my 2 seconds left.
Thank you. Appreciate the benefit. And I was going to say, we have a hard stop at noon. We'll get to as many people as we can. Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all three of you for your insightful, candid testimony. And General Votel, always good to see a fellow Ranger. Rangers lead the way. Thank you for your continued service. In my time in Iraq and Afghanistan, I learned the value of our partners and our alliances, and I've been very troubled by some of the comments of this administration with regard to those partnerships and those alliances. I know, General Votel, you weren't consulted in the Syria decision. Have the three of you had to spend time in the last 2 years talking with our partners and our allies, NATO and others, to reassure them that we remain committed? And have you received questions and concerns from those allies?
I'll start, Congressman. Certainly we have. I think this is a very standard thing that we talk with all of our partners about routinely here, about our strategies and where we're going with this, and reassurance on our commitment to the collective security of the region here. So it certainly is something we talk with our partners about all the time. Have for the entire time I've been in this position.
But within the past, let's say within the past year, especially with respect to comments on a unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan and Syria, has that created especially acute concerns?
Well, it certainly has. I mean, some of the rather sharp announcements here are things that have caught their attention, and we've had to talk about that. But again, this is something that we have routinely talked about. As I came into this position in 2016, a big topic was JCPOA and our decision to enter into that, and so that was a big discussion point with all the partners in the region. Many who did not agree with that decision, and so we had almost the opposite situation in that particular case. So I think this is something we always have to talk to our partners about.
Very briefly, I would just say that this is a conversation we always have and we will always continue to have. Because the bottom line is it's important to have a good working relationship, mill-to-mill relationship, because if for whatever reason the political relationship goes off tracks or hits a bump in the road, if you have a strong mill-to-mill relationship, if you have a good partnership, that will carry the day. And that's where we try to come at it with from the military side.
In particular, with respect to on the political side or the policymaking side, the coalition, particularly the 79-strong de-ISIS coalition, is a huge value, as the General said, to sort of the moral authority of the global campaign or the global effort to address a global threat. I think in the days and weeks after certain decisions, yes, we obviously keep up the level of transparency as much as possible. I mean, everybody knows that the Syria tweet was somewhat of a surprise, and so, you know, I did call all of the core group of the coalition the day after to make sure that they understood both what it was but also what it wasn't, and that wasn't sort of they're all leaving tomorrow. Of course, as decisions evolve and we're living in a dynamic world, we're living in a dynamic policymaking world as well. You know, we continue to keep them as informed, transparently, and in connection as possible.
Thank you. One last question. Do you all believe that you have sufficient data and information regarding the emergent threats posed by climate change, namely disease outbreaks, pandemics, displacement of populations, and drought to take into account as you develop your op plans within your respective commands?
Congressman, I do. That is provided to us through the Department of Defense, and from my staff standpoint, I believe we do.
I believe we do as well, and I would just echo the fact that in the AFRICOM AOR, this is a big part of whatever we do. A crisis response not only is kinetic, but tied to the Ebola outbreaks, the disease outbreaks, and it's a big part of our strategy with regards to containing that type of threat on the continent.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just don't think I can go and let people say things without responding. First of all, our failure to respond in Syria in 2013 left the void, which the Russians quickly filled where they had not been before, but because we had no action whatsoever for a long period of time, even a delayed reaction after they gassed their government gassed their own people. That is part of the reason that we have Russian influence in Syria now, not just the tweets of recent days. Second, I had a much different experience in the Munich Security Conference with Senator Inhofe, with our allies and our people there than obviously other people, my colleagues did. Because what I found in our European allies and allies across the nation, we met with Germany, we met with Afghan president, we met with Poland, is there is a much greater participation in meeting their 2% GDP requirements as to their militaries across Europe, which means we have partners who are actually contributing rather than talking. And so I think that's very important to point out. We also went to Africa and met with President Kagame, with Prime Minister Dr. Abiy in Ethiopia. I think those relationships with Senator Inhofe and us as members of Congress can be sustained long term. He's been doing it for over 25 years, but I think many times they're much more valuable even than those with states sometime, as well as the mill-to-mill relationships. All that being said, I guess now I'm going to try to get to a question. First of all, General Votel, thank you for your leadership of my 155th BCT, my old brigade in Operation Spartan Shield, and my 184th ESC, which are currently deployed and doing the logistics missions over there. General Votel and General Waldhauser, after I answer this question, I want you to respond what we can do better with the state partnership program in Africa. But Mississippi has a state partnership with Uzbekistan. We have made great strides there. As a matter of fact, almost every time I go, I meet with the president of Uzbekistan and all of their cabinet. General Votel, how valuable are those in the negotiations when we're talking about negotiating with the Taliban or logistics contract? How valuable is that state partnership program?
Across the region, Congressman, the state partnership program is a diamond for us, frankly, and it is highly sought after by partners across the region. It augments, it not only augments the things that we do with the active forces and the other rotational forces, as you highlighted, that come into the region, but more importantly, it provides a long-term, sustained relationship with these countries. As you've experienced in Uzbekistan, I know we recently had the Minister of Defense visit your state for an exercise here. Thank you for hosting him. We cannot replace these types of relationships. This is absolutely vital to the things we're doing.
And General Waldhauser, I think there's some opportunities in Africa to sustain long-term relationships. And do we have good partnership programs, or is there opportunity there?
Congressman, I could take the rest of the time and really the rest of the day up until noon and beyond to talk about the value of these programs. And let me just give you one quick example. We have 13 state partnership programs on the continent, and we appreciate the funding that comes from them, and we certainly would ask for more there. Recently, we had an exercise in Burkina Faso. There's been some issues there as to the uptick in attacks and whatnot. And just recently here in January, the District of Columbia, D.C., just signed a state partnership program with Burkina Faso. So on one hand, you could say that, are we doing enough there? But this is another tool in the toolkit for long-term continuity with relationship building and so forth, that in an area where there's a counterterrorism issue, this is a big plus for us. I can't say enough about the state partnership program in AFRICOM.
And final, I guess this is just a comment. Ms. Wilbarger, you can comment if there's time left. But I don't have a problem with negotiating with the Taliban or any other. You know, as we just saw our president do in North Korea, it's okay to have a meeting and to walk away with that meeting if your objectives are not achieved. It's not okay not to ever have a meeting, because I can tell you, you can never reach consensus if you're not talking. And so I think we have a lot of opportunity. I'm skeptical, just like everyone else, General Votel, but I know we also have Uzbekistan involved in that. I know Pakistan's involved in that. I know there are a lot of people involved in the peace process there, and I'm quite confident that our president and our military and our State Department will walk away if we don't get the conditions met that we need to for peace, but we have to talk to get to peace. And if you can comment very briefly, Ms. Wilbarger.
Sure, I'll just briefly say, look, long-term insurgencies mostly need to end by reconciliation. That's sort of the history of these kind of conflicts. And I also agree that the military is both the U.S. military, but in conjunction with our partners on the ground, will continue the military pressure during these talks.
Yeah. I completely agree with Mr. Kelly's assessment that we do need to talk. So, so only way to get there. Ms. Wilhan.
Thank you to the chairman and thank you to the panel for coming. In addition to sitting on this, on the Armed Services, I also sit in Foreign Affairs in Africa and the Asia subcommittees, and in the Africa subcommittee, Human Rights is a center area of that, and it's been lovely to also hear about China in this conversation too. And so my question is for the General Waldhauser. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the importance of supporting women, and particularly the impact that they have on bolstering economies, which is one of the best ways that we have to combat VEOs. And as we continue to provide support to our African partners to combat VEOs, are there members of our current multinational joint task force that have not perhaps passed the Leahy vetting or who have raised human rights concerns, especially as they relate to women and girls?
So thank you for the question. Let me just talk real quick about the Women Peace Security Initiative that we have at AFRICOM, and one of the things that I think we do very well. And I'll just give you several examples. So over the past couple of years, we've introduced women from the military in the communications field across the continent through various exercises and engagements. And since we've emphasized that, we've noticed the numbers of women who participate in that particular event has grown. We also do an intelligence assessment and training for the women of intelligence branches around the continent. That number has grown. We have a leadership that we run out of AFRICOM every year. It's a small group, around 50 or 60, but we take them around the country to various bases, and they talk with various leaders, and we promote leadership through women for women in a small way, but we think a highly effective way. And here recently, we've had the operation I mentioned in Burkina Faso. It's a special operations operation where we've brought women together to have conferences, discuss their way ahead, and try to get them and highlight their visibility for the military. So we take that seriously, and I'm very proud of our Women in Peace program. With regards to the Leahy vetting, look, one of the things that we do with all of our training on the African continent is this whole issue of battlefield ethics, law of war compliance, and the like. And even though there's, we run into issues every once in a while, we maintain that this is a big part of how we train. And we make it very clear to these governments that if there's violations or allegations of violation, that they have to look at them for investigation and be transparent with what they do. So on one hand, the question of the Leahy vetting, yes, sometimes there are some issues we have to work around because whole units for one individual. But in the main, on the African continent, we need to maintain that because the human rights piece is a big part of how we train, and we just have to try to perhaps streamline some of the Leahy issues, but we can't walk away from that.
Sir, are there curing processes or curing timelines if you do see some sort of violation that I understand that you can't help if you're not there? Is there any sort of process that is codified that helps us with that?
I'd have to take that for the record, ma'am.
Thank you. My next question is also for you, and I read in your written statement that Niger remains very unstable, and that you are worried about that because of the youth, the age of the large part of the country. And my question is, you also seem to indicate that the people who you were withdrawing in the 10% reduction were counterterrorism related. Is that true? Doesn't that provide some sort of angst on your part that you've got this sort of unstable, very young nation state, and we're withdrawing the very people who may be helpful if there is some sort of a VEO activity there?
So I don't want to get into specific countries and specific numbers, but the short answer to your question is yes. And we have to take a look at where we have optimized. And as I tried to indicate previously, for the first tranche, we've taken individuals from locations where they've been training for quite some time, and those units are on their own. And so, yes, every country, especially in Western Africa, where we have bilateral agreements and where we train with them, we are concerned, but we understand the intent, And so far, there's been minimal impact. And if we continue to work with our partners, primarily the French in the West, we watch if the groups grow, we may have to revisit some of these decisions.
Thank you. And with my last 50 seconds, my last question is also for you, which has to do with Congo and the most recent Ebola outbreak. We've had about 550, 560 deaths so far and 800 people who have fallen ill again. And I just wanted to ask you sort of to assess the biosecurity threats in the area and whether or not you feel as though we are doing enough or the right things to build partnerships across the African partners that we have, and whether or not you think you're appropriately staffed in that particular area, and how you're working with USAID and the State Department to make sure we don't get befelled by a pandemic.
So I'm looking at the time countdown, and I'm counting the questions and trying to see. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a very, very complex place right now. They just had a election. Joseph Kabila, finally, after a long time, is gone. The issue in the Ebola crisis in the east is one of the most remote parts of the African continent. There are numerous violent extremist organizations, groups there. That's one of the problems, one of the threats. And we have been asked to look at what it would take security-wise by the State Department if we upped our footprint, and we've done that. I would just finally say, just for perspective, when the big Ebola outbreak took place several years ago, 28,000 plus cases, 11,000 plus died. So as you said, about 900 cases thus far, 600, 550 or so died. A key has been vaccinations. Over 70 to 80,000 have been vaccinated, but the security environment is very difficult, and that's what makes this one a particular challenge and a concern.
Thank you. We're going to stretch a little to try to get the last few people in here, so we might not, probably won't start the classified until 12:15, but if the last few people can help out at all with any time there, it would be appreciated. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to follow up on the previous lines of questions regarding the future of Afghanistan. Like many of my colleagues, I am deeply concerned about the ongoing talks with the Taliban. And last month, I also attended the Munich Security Conference with some other members here, and we had the opportunity to meet with President Ghani, who made it very clear that he does not respect the validity of these talks, considering the fact that the democratically elected government is completely excluded from these talks. So my question for General Votel is, I share that concern that the democratically elected government is not a part of these negotiations. And at the same time, we are heading towards presidential elections in Afghanistan. So how do the ongoing talks impact the overall legitimacy of the upcoming elections and the overall stability as we head into the upcoming elections?
Well, I think certainly the fact that there is an upcoming election is a factor in the overall situation, right, at this particular point. You know, I can't dispute the fact that that's an aspect of this. But Congresswoman, I am not orchestrating the talks that Ambassador Khalilzad is doing. We speak with him obviously very regularly. We support him as closely as we can. It is my observation from my close discussions with him that he is in fact consulting with President Ghani on a regular basis, keeping him well informed, and that the actual initiation of these discussions was done with President Ghani's knowledge and support. He is continuing to do that, and he continues to do that throughout this process. We recognize that the discussions, the negotiations, ultimately have to be Afghan to Afghan discussions, and that is what Ambassador Khalilzad is focused on at this particular point.
Okay, I appreciate that, General Votel, but President Ghani's message to us was crystal clear that not having the democratically elected government have a seat at the table during the negotiations nullifies how they could come to a positive outcome. So I just wanted to share my concern, particularly as it relates to the legitimacy of the upcoming elections and how we are potentially undermining that by engaging in these talks with the Taliban. My next question is also for you, General Votel. You talked about shrinking the physical caliphate to less than 1 square mile, which is an enormous achievement. Can you talk about this next phase, that as ISIS fighters go underground, you said, quote, they are unrepentant, unbroken, and they are still deeply radicalized. What does that next phase look like from your perspective?
This will look very much like an insurgency, meaning that what we will see low-level attacks, we'll see assassinations, we'll see IED attacks, we'll see ambush type things as they begin to emerge from this. So therefore, what our focus has to be is working with our partners on the ground as we're doing in fairly effectively in Iraq right now, is working with our partners on the ground. We are going to have to keep pressure on this. Our intelligence capabilities will continue to be very, very important in feeding their operations. Our train, advise, assist, our enabling capabilities we have on the ground will be very, very important to this. So what we are attempting to do is prevent those things from disrupting the other stability operations that we are trying to conduct with local governance, local security forces.
Thank you. And General Waldhauser, I wanted to follow up on your opening statement. What I noticed was absent is lessons learned regarding the fateful attack in Niger that took place in October 2017. How has U.S. AFRICOM, along with interagency and by, with, and through partnerships, what have we learned? How have we updated our intel collection? How are we making sure that our operators have access to the most up-to-date, accurate, exquisite intel possible? And I also wanted to ask, when can we expect to see the report in Section 1276 of the FY19 NDAA?
So first of all, Congresswoman, there's been many lessons learned and changes to procedures since the Niger incident a while back. And at the tactical level, which I won't go into great detail, I can assure you that minimum force, reaction times for medevac, standard procedures for how orders are issued and who approves those orders, those have all been really dealt with and taken care of at the component level, and those are all in place. The investigation itself had 23 findings, 19 of which required action. 7 of those were for AFRICOM. The others were for the Army and for U.S. SOCOM. The items that AFRICOM had to, as an example, would be formalizing memorandums of agreement with the French for medevac, which we've done, updating the number of Blue Force trackers, for example, that troops have on the ground, and those type of things. So from the AFRICOM perspective, all the tactical items which weren't part of the investigation but needed to be fixed, those have been taken care of, and we can talk in closed session if you want more detail. And as far as the investigation goes, we're good.
Thank you.
We can talk more, and a lot of this is better in a closed session anyway. So
Thank
we
you.
can talk more when we get upstairs. Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your service to our country. I'll keep this brief, but since the 70s, spending for military and civilian tools of national security have ebbed and flows. During the 80s, they both went up. During the 90s, they both went down. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis said, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I have to buy more ammunition." Ultimately, you both have been on the record as saying how important diplomatic relations are and humanitarian aid are to national security. With the budget coming out and we kind of expecting maybe another cut in both in the State Department, USAID, overseas contingency operations, I mean, would you both agree, or all of you agree, that reduced resources for the State Department and USAID will have an impact on national security in your regions?
Yes, I would absolutely agree, Congressman.
Okay. So by failing to address like famine, disease, humanitarian catastrophes, education, whether it be Syria or Niger, Yemen, anywhere in your regions, as these resources are cut, what kind of impact is that going to have on national security in your regions?
Well, Congressman, I think, first of all, we have to understand the global effort in some of these areas, the global NGO, non-governmental organization effort that really have done a good job. So in places like Somalia, for example, where this year food insecurity is somewhere around 4.2 million people, we have offered assistance to the NGOs, for example, logistical and even intelligence. But for the most part, they've learned a lot of lessons, staged a lot of logistical support, and they are dealing with that situation. Now, with regards to the U.S. specifically, though, I mean, our engagement and our involvement needs to be maintained because there's like 12.5 million displaced persons on the African continent, which causes security issues and challenges for the governments to have to deal with them from a fiscal perspective.
Congressman, I would agree with General Waldhauser on this. I think our involvement in this continues to be extraordinarily important. As we look and clear through areas, as we conduct our counterterrorism operations, such as we're doing against ISIS right now, the resources that come along with some of the stability aspects that must always follow these combat operations doing are absolutely essential to bring people back into their communities, to start standing up the essential services, and to give the local governance, local security, an opportunity to begin to reestablish life in these areas. So I would agree this is absolutely essential, and we have to stay engaged in this.
So just to follow up on that, as you've kind of talked about how the Chinese and the Russians are kind of filling the void diplomatically in some of these regions, are they filling the void humanitarian as we cut humanitarian aid, or are they kind of picking up their humanitarian efforts in order to build better relationships with these foreign governments?
To a certain degree, yes. I mean, they've got about 2,000 UN peacekeepers. They've tried to insert themselves. I don't say that in a negative way, but they've tried to contribute to the Ebola crisis we talked about in the DRC. They want to become a leader in that particular medical technology. They have made strides in that area, and at the end of the day, that's not bad. I mean, there are places, certainly on the African continent, where we have to cooperate with the Chinese, but there are times we have to confront and also compete with them. But when they build infrastructure, if they contribute to vaccinations in the Ebola crisis and so forth, that's not necessarily bad. It's actually helpful.
I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Kam.
Thank you so much for coming out here and answering our questions. I wanted to address General Votel. First of all, I just want to echo the comments of a lot of my colleagues and just thanking you for your service as someone who's been working this space before. I know we are indebted as a nation for what you have done and the great work that you have done over the years. I wanted to follow up on something you said earlier. You were talking about how a lot of the efforts that we're engaging in now in Syria and in Iraq in particular, which is what I'm focused on with this question line, is about now shifting towards dealing with an insurgency, that a lot of the territorial land held by ISIS has been taken back. We are in some ways changing the mission in terms of what we're trying to be doing now. And my question to you is just trying to get your assessments, your honest assessments of where the Iraqi security forces are in terms of that. We've been working so much with this by, with, and through, and I'm just trying to get a sense of what is different now in 2019 compared to 2013, specifically in terms of how they're ready to handle this newer mission of reverting back to dealing with an insurgency.
Thank you, Congressman. From our perspective, we don't look at this as a change in mission. Our mission still is at the invitation of the government of Iraq to assist them in defeating ISIS. So from our perspective, we look at it very much the same. My assessment of the Iraqi security forces right now is that they are doing a pretty good job of keeping pressure on the remnants of ISIS that exist in Iraq. In some cases, they are doing this unilaterally, and in other cases, they are doing this with our assistance. Each of their units across the country have different levels of readiness and different levels of capability, and we're continuing to work to raise those to a higher standard so they can be self-sustaining. But they are continuing to do that. What is different, I think, is that they have been, from 2013, 2014, and whatnot, they have been well supported by their civilian government. The current Iraqi leadership are very, very strong supporters of their military. The former Prime Minister Badi, was an extraordinary wartime leader, in my opinion, and he provided exceptional support to them. I think the military leaders saw this. They saw the necessity of the situation, and they rallied behind the coalition support that we provided to them and rose to the occasion. And good leaders emerged on the Iraqi side that helped them orchestrate this campaign, and we are continuing to see that today. They certainly have more that needs to be done. It needs to be a more inclusive force. It needs to include more Sunnis. It needs to include more Kurds in it, and we are working towards that. We're going to have to address popular mobilization forces, these elements that are part of the security forces as well. But I am very confident in the current military leadership that we see in Iraq, in this, again, moving in the right direction.
That's right. I share a lot of those concerns going forward about how we can do this and make sure that the skills that we've been building up aren't going to atrophy as we start to move on. And as we've seen before, we've certainly seen a lot of success with the counterterrorism service and others in terms of going in, being able to penetrate ISIS defenses, but we've also seen the difficulties of what happened in 2013 and 2014 when the Iraqi security forces were asked to hold on to territory, and what is their ability to hold, and that's where I'm just trying to delve off of. Just one last question here. I know that, you know, in your past work, you've done a lot with the counterterrorism service in Iraq, and I know that they were such a critical force there that had gone through a lot over the last couple of years in terms of what was asked of them in terms of going through some very difficult circumstances. Specifically with that organization, the CTS, what is their current capacity and how crucial are they in this now mission? Again, I agree with you, it's not a change in mission, but certainly a focus more on hold rather than the other components. How crucial is the CTS in maintaining that?
CTS remains extraordinarily critical in terms of this, and it is their desire and our support to that desire to return the CTS to their more traditional missions of counterterrorism operations, and that is what we are working on. So we stayed with the CTS when we left in 2011. That was important, and that was a reliable force, and they carried the heavy load over the campaign. And as we move in the future, we have to sustain that, but we also have to stay with the Iraqi security forces as well. The Iraqi army can be the bulwark against extremism in this country, and we need to support them.
Well, I certainly hope so, and I will do everything I can from this angle to be able to support those missions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member.
A major focus for both parties and the administration the last 2 years has been to repair the readiness of our forces. I had one of your fellow combatant commanders tell me recently that he can already tell a difference in the forces that are being rotated through his command. I don't know if it applies so much to CENTCOM because y'all have been the priority theater for 17 years, but my question to each of you is, can you at this point tell the difference yet in the readiness of the forces that are rotated through your commands?
Yeah, Congressman, yeah, from our perspective, I think we certainly can. We have, as you know, we've been dependent upon the services to provide us well-trained forces, and we have been the lucky recipients of that for a long period of time. So I remain very, very grateful for that. I would highlight one thing: the Army's investment in security force assistance brigades, I think, is a good example of how our services are really supporting us in the way that we need. This is an organization that is specifically designed to help with the by, with, and through approach that we are applying so effectively on the ground in a number of areas. And so, to me, I think the services, my service in particular in this case, I think is doing an excellent job of providing us the capabilities that we need to pursue these missions.
And just to emphasize, you can tell the readiness level is improving already?
It's always been uniformly high in CENTCOM, and so it is certainly sustained, and I have no concerns about any of the forces that are coming into the CENTCOM area of responsibility.
General Waldhauser, is it getting better yet?
Congressman, a little bit more nuance, I think, for AFRICOM, and that is, I would say that the special operations forces that we have that are engaged in the kinetic activities are as good as they ever have been. Their readiness has been always good and continues to be so. I would just say a quick point on the SFAB that General Votel mentioned. We would have a lot of work for them if we had one assigned to AFRICOM. There's plenty of things they could do to contribute. And finally, I would just say that also in AFRICOM we have locations with ranges and so forth that will allow readiness to be maintained and even improved, and we'd like to sell that to the services too. Sometimes they think that perhaps on the African continent they will lose readiness, but we always like to say that they can gain and even maintain and even gain readiness at some of the places where they could train.
Thank you.
We are over time, but Mr. Gallego, I will yield to you. We will have to do it quickly. Got to get upstairs for the classified session. When we're done here, we'll move up. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Waldhauser, last week the New York Times published an account of an operation in Sudan in 2013 that suffered from problems eerily similar to what we saw in the Niger ambush of 2017. I personally, as a Marine, know what it's like to have bad leadership and bad equipment but still be required to go into combat several times. I can tell you, General, it is an awful feeling. So please tell me, General, what has AFRICOM or DOD done to change the way they do business so that we don't see more Niger ambush situations or Sudan, or any number of unreported incidents in your command over the past several years that are no longer, quote-unquote, situation normal?
So, Congressman, as indicated earlier, some of the things that we've done since the Niger incident have to do with the tactical actions and procedures on the ground, and minimum force requirements, timelines for medevac and casevac, coordination efforts, weather and so forth, overhead armed ISR where it's applicable, ISR together with that. And then when you tie in with what we've been doing recently, after a long time of working with these units, we are now advising them at a higher level where we do mostly at the battalion level and to a large degree remotely. We have the ability to do the same thing, and so those are some of the things we've changed since.
Thank you, Joe, and I'm aware of some of that. One of the things that I'm not aware of is who has been held responsible for this epic failure that cost some men our lives. So far, what I've read is that the Army brass is basically trying to blame junior officers both before and after the Niger ambush. So who is being held responsible? You are the AFRICOM commander. Who is responsible for these failures? And it's not junior officers.
So, Congressman, the issue of the investigation right now lies with the Secretary of Defense. The issue of accountability and awards and so forth come from SOCOM. I know, though, I'm not privy to those discussions, but I know they've been ongoing. But perhaps, Katie, I don't know from the OSD perspective the status, but I would just say again, the investigation completed and the actions.
How much longer is the investigation going to take place? This is almost 2 years now.
I'll just add that the report and that very question on the responsibilities and the awards is with Secretary of Defense. He takes this very seriously. Obviously, we've had a transition of authority within having a new secretary. He's reviewing this carefully, and we are expecting you to get that final report here shortly, which will answer that very question.
And once that report comes out, you're going to actually go hold the DoD personnel, whether they be generals or below, responsible for this disaster, correct?
That's a decision with the Secretary at this moment, and he will be able to provide you that information as soon as he finalizes his decision.
Okay. Ms. Wheelberg, Section 1212 of last year's NDA required a review of advised, assist, and accompany missions from the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. There were clearly issues about these missions as laid bare by the ambush. So why haven't you provided this report to us?
I believe this report is tied up in finally having the Secretary's complete decisions on all the recommendations going forward, and as soon as he does, we will provide the report. Okay.
I also like to know what is and it could be either General Waldberg or Ms. Wilberger, I apologize. What is the status of of providing redacted reports of the Niger investigation to the families of the deceased U.S. soldiers?
My understanding is all of the reporting requirements will be released as soon as, including the redacted reports to the families, as soon as the final decisions that are outstanding are made by the Secretary.
So that's including the autopsy reports?
I would have to take that back.
Yeah, well, my understanding is that once the Secretary signs off on this, then those redacted versions will go to the family first, just like we did at the outset of this. As you may recall, the team went to each family and spent hours with them to give them the first look at this, and I'm sure it's been taking a long time, and I know that they've had a lot to process and probably have more questions, but it's my understanding that—
General, without a doubt that the family has actually been able to process this. I think the problem that we have is we actually can't process what actually occurred because we're not getting a full report. I think that's my dissatisfaction right now because there are currently operations probably happening in AFRICOM, and I have zero doubt that there's actually been full change because I don't know who actually was responsible for this major mess up. And it scares me that the DoD is at this point still hiding this information, and it's been 2 years. So I hope that that will be coming out soon because I think then we'll have to take extraordinary measures to actually get that to happen. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Just quickly at the end, the only comment I will make, I know a lot of people have raised concerns about Afghanistan, and no matter which path you take, there are going to be concerns about Afghanistan, but trying to find a negotiated settlement is the best way forward, without question. We don't presume what that settlement's going to be, but I, for one, am supportive of the negotiations and the discussion you're having, because ultimately our goal is to reduce our footprint in Afghanistan, reduce the risk, men and women in our armed forces' lives are at risk in Afghanistan every day right now. To the extent that we can shift that responsibility to people in the region, I'm all for it. It's not going to be easy. It's a very, very difficult part of the world, as you know far, far better than I do. But it is the direction we have to go if we're going to get to the outcome that we want. So I appreciate those efforts, and we'll certainly stay in touch with you on the details of them. And with that, take a brief break, and we'll reconvene upstairs in a few minutes.